tell me about your recycled material and what is your recycled material made from?
Excellent. So we're starting with two areas. The main thrust will be PET, and the main reason we can see that is recycling, I guess, does two things. One is certain materials, if you've already used a lot of energy and resource to build the material, that's great to keep it in the loop. But also, there's a lot of plastics being generated in the world that aren't being consumed, and if we can increase the value of capturing those, again, it's better. And so I think for us, when we're in that polyester space, if we can bring more single-use plastic bottles out of waste streams and into recycling streams, then that feels like a valuable kind of clean-up act. But then also many of our, where we've previously used virgin polyesters, it's generally we're seeing the polyester not as a high-spec engineering material where we need super high abrasion resistance, super high tensile. It's when it's in the more everyday wear areas that the properties we can get out of a PET family are more than sufficient for the average life of the bag. And so that's a big thrust for us. And then there's particular case needs where, say, it's in high intensity travel, things are getting bashed around a lot more, where we feel we need to move into the polyamide family, so nylons. Unfortunately, the recycling loops aren't as established in nylons, and so what we're doing in the nylon recycling family for the higher abrasion resistance, higher tensile strengths, is we're starting with sometimes it will be a mix of virgin and recycled nylons, and that we have to step even more carefully there, because the cases we're using those nylons are in the more demanding cases where you need sort of the next level of performance, and so we're sort of moving into that one a little with smaller steps to make sure we can truly live up to the performance expectations.
So is that why you're doing this now, maybe why it's taking you a bit to get to recycled materials, that you really wanted to ensure the properties of the materials are right before you use them?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think we're so inspired by the cradle to cradle philosophies, and the end state of that for any technical nutrient like a petroleum derived plastic is where the loop goes on forever, and you're forever capturing these materials. But one of the challenges is the technology hasn't really been there to capture it at end of life, to upcycle it. Bags do require a lot of other components, so how do we break this down? How do we disassemble? Many of the things we've spoken about before. And so as we've built our own I guess principles for how we'll approach a more sustainable product life cycle, one of the things we've tried to be really honest about is a lot of the research around sustainability, as we've talked about in other conversations, is often based around apparel. And in apparel, it's still somewhere between 68 to 80% of the energy and impact is before the product ever gets to the consumer, and then they start washing, laundering, often tumble drying, and there's a lot more energy expended there, where in the products we make you don't put them through a washing machine. And so for us it's more like 90 to 95% of the energy and the impact is before the customer ever receives the product. And so we've really said product used in mud for as long as possible is the single biggest impact we can make in this space. And if we keep prioritising product that will have a long life, a valuable life, and not just lasting, but actually remaining desirable over that time, so it doesn't end up in the bottom of your cupboard and you rarely sort of pull it out because it got a bit grubby or it got a bit scuffed. So we've said we're not willing to compromise on the longevity of the product, But as the technology's catching up, as we're getting better recycling tech to clean out impurities, to sort of make sure we can test and maintain the integrity of the polymer even on its second time round, now we feel like it's at a state where we can produce product that will have a life well beyond day 1000, well into it.
Yeah, definitely, and that's something we have talked about was, the benefits of being a carry brand and not an apparel brand, and that you don't have the same. One of the critiques of recycled polyester, and polyester in general in the apparel world, is the issue of microfibers and the issue of chemicals next to your skin. And so one of the great benefits of using this material in bags is that you don't really have those same kind of barriers. So it's a more appropriate fabric for accessories than it is for apparel in a lot of instances. But I want to back up for just a second. You mentioned petroleum, and I think that it's I'm not sure that a lot of people actually realize the feedstock for polyester, and so recycled polyester gets a lot of talk about where the feedstock comes from because we're all excited about the fact that it's from plastic water bottles. But can you talk just a bit about the bigger issues around virgin polyester and how using a recycled material kind of alleviates some of those issues?
Yeah, so I think for us, we try and think about things from many different filters. One of those includes economics and economic principles. One includes desire, motivation, emotions, those sorts of things. And one of the problems with things that you dig out of the ground is you often get something cheaper than it should really be. Like petroleum, exactly. So you dig a well, all of a sudden you're pumping this thing that has been often millions of years in the making. Like, this is getting compressed over, millennia. It's developing a more and more energy intensive makeup. And so when you dig that out of the ground and you don't have to pay for the carbon that will be released through its use, and you don't have to pay for all the downstream effects, which is not currently priced into any major economic model in the world, it's artificially cheap. And one of the problems with artificially cheap things is those that get access to it can make too much money from it. And so when you track what happens with many of the, economic models around petroleum, is few people make a huge amount of money, and they're not properly paying for all the consequences of that, and you're distorting whole economies. And so we can see a lot of foreign policies around preserving access to these incredibly energy dense materials like petroleum. And so you often get war, conflict, you often get distorted cross-border politics, you often get invading countries to preserve access to oil. And so there's this whole extra baggage that comes with harvesting a material that you sort of got too cheap, because then it's distorting people. They want to preserve that skewed market access. And so it's not just that we're not capturing downstream effects that they cause. It's also that you're seeing war, you're seeing conflict, you're seeing distorted cross-border politics. And so I think the more we can get off these materials and get back to materials that are justified in their price, their fair price, the more you end up with more honest economics and more honest behaviour around those materials. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense to you, the way I describe it?
Yeah, no, it definitely does, and I think you're right in exactly that. Those externalities of their contribution to climate change and their destruction of the environment, like those aspects of materials are not included in their price. And actually, when we look at polyester in its life cycle assessment, it's actually considered a free material, and we don't account for any of those materials. So it often gets promoted as a more sustainable option than natural fibers because you don't need water to grow it and you don't need all those other things. But in fact, you're exactly right in that it is so skewed, and that's not the entire story. So that kind of brings me to one of my tough questions for you,
Yeah.
a bit of a moral quandary.
Yeah.
So recycled materials is all well and good. It's great to be using something that is waste instead of having to dig it out of the ground. But isn't it just a bit of a Band-Aid solution? You're not, by creating a demand for recycled fabrics, you're essentially creating a demand for plastic water bottles. So you're not exactly turning the tap off at the faucet. And so how do you feel morally about that, I guess? You know, you're still using plastic if you're still creating products that are made from polyester, whether the feedstock comes from oil extraction or recycled plastic bottles, it's still made from plastic. So would you be happy to see your feedstock essentially not exist one day?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So I think one of the things we really try and do in the world is balance practical and theoretical. I think when we look at where we want to get to in the future, I think it would be excellent if there was, amazing regenerative agriculture that was building new nutrients into the soil, it was capturing carbon, it was doing so many great things. And I think there are particular areas of product where that sort of thing makes even more sense. As you described earlier, certain product categories are against your skin, they need to absorb some moisture, they need to be permeable to evaporation, to your sweat. They need to do many of the things where you will pay extra to have that natural material next to your skin. Then there's like the long-term vision for where we would love to get to is where we can be working in that biological nutrient stream, where we're replenishing soils, we're doing all these things. But if we actually look at the problems of the world right now, there are just millions of tons of plastic still being generated, still polluting life cycle streams, polluting ecosystems. And so I don't think there's a single solution. I think many people want to simplify problems and say it's about one thing. And there's very rarely solutions that are just one thing. It's all.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Exactly. And so I think for us, what we're saying is, as a planet, we need to be working on many solutions. One of those solutions is cleaning up and repurposing the things that are already in the system somewhere. And there are so many single-use plastics still being generated. They will continue to be generated for many years. And one of our goals is to find a second or third time around the loop for those things, and then eventually even maybe a permanent loop around those things. And then on the other side, there's some pretty terrible farming practices. When you look at a lot of the conventional cotton industry, it's massively water intensive, it needs a huge amount of pesticides, all the things we've spoken about, some of those problems with the biological nutrients as they're being farmed currently. So I think what we want to do is start pushing on several areas where each area solves a different problem. It progresses us and moves us closer to a future vision of genuine flourishing and more than just sustaining, but actually improving. And so I think when we are looking at this, we know we're going to have to find uses for all that plastic that's been generated over the last many decades and is continuing to be generated. So let's find some ways that do that. And then let's also start work on some of those regenerative agricultural practices and principles, and let's find some uses for those materials where it makes excellent sense to pioneer this much more considered biological nutrient family of materials. The other part to being the carry brand is a bag often needs zippers and buckles and webbings and straps, and many of the biological nutrients, so cottons and hemps and those sorts of things, often don't yet have the tensile strengths and the abrasion resistances for the really high demand areas. That's a very long way to say I think we need several solutions because there are currently many problems that we want to make progress on.
Yes, and there's a very big mess that needs to be cleaned up.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So the bags, they're not 100% recyclable, correct? The trims
Correct.
that you mentioned, the zippers and the webbing and all of that, those aren't recycled yet, but is that the goal?
Yeah, so our goal, again, being informed by those, just the brilliant work that went into the cradle-to-cradle principles, which is often now, I guess, being talked about as circularity, is can we develop products that are either entirely technical nutrients that will endlessly be recycled and upcycled, and then can we develop products that are wholly biological nutrients that could decompose, could go back into nutrients that then regrow into new product components and materials. And the reality of where we are in the world right now is that's still hard. It's still really difficult. And so there's many projects we need to do along the way to get us to a point where that can truly happen. But we need to be making progress in the big chunky bits of each of those, move each of them along. And then our hope is the work we're doing with phenomenal partners and minds and consultants and sharing knowledge amongst other brands working in these spaces, we can all move more and more of the percentage of the product towards a cleaner and cleaner vision of genuine sustainability and even better.
Yeah, so the fabrics and the linings, they're 100% recycled. So when you get to that point, or I guess even at this point, they're made from recycled materials, but are they recyclable? Is the circularity question of it all.
Yeah, excellent. So I think that idea of, as we're moving towards a true circular system, if you can learn to make it go around one more loop than just a single journey from start to end, if you can get it to go around one loop, that's progress. If you can get it to go around two loops, that's more progress. If you can get it to go around indefinitely, that's more progress again. So the way we've said we want to start this is with we will act as the second loop for second-use plastics like water bottles. At the moment, what we're then doing is really working hard on some principles of how would we then take back that product and learn to move it into the next loop. I think as we've talked about in other sessions, we are very aware that it's too hard to ask every customer to know how to recycle each thing.
Yeah.
So depending on the area you live in, rubbish tips will be operated very differently. Recycling programs will be operated very differently. And so our goal, hopefully, and this is one of the things we've so much enjoyed starting to explore with you, is what would a take-back system look like that then lets us responsibly guide it into each of the highest value streams we can from that point. But I think it's hard, it's tricky, it's easier in some areas than others, and so I think we're fighting hard to make progress in a couple of areas first, learn from that, and then start to expand it into some broader categories.
So why not just let the water bottles be recycled back into water bottles? Why pull them into the material space and not just let them perpetually be recycled as water bottles?
So the biggest reason motivating us in this is when you actually look at the companies making water bottles, they're not motivated generally to pay for the more sustainable system. They're often massive corporations that are very much beholden to their shareholders. They need to maximise a return on investment, and so they are making decisions to cut costs everywhere they can. And that means it's hard to put a value on the recycled component. So some of them are getting great at building layers into the water bottle, where the inside layer and the outside layer might be virgin polymer, and then they can blend a little bit of post-production recycled content into the middle layers. But they're unlikely to have enough value on a bottle when they're looking to make these bottles in cents, not dollars. Like there's very little ability to pay extra in that space when you look at the businesses operating. Where if we can assign a value to this idea of starting to close the loop and let things go around a bit more, when you're selling something for dollars rather than cents, there's more ability to let that progress be priced in to the product. And so in a way, it's taking what was some plastic worth some cents and moving it into a product now worth many dollars. And so it's essentially adding value through the story and the progress you can make on these circular economies. It's actually easier to absorb that in the price of a bag than in the price of a bottle that has to be generated in the millions at microscopic prices.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And like, get all the waste to the good guys and then let the good guys do something good with it. Instead of putting the responsibility, because you're right. At the end of the day, it is about economics, and you can't do any of these things if you're not in business, and you still have to be making and turning a profit.
If you can start to really value add around that at the higher price stuff, you can start to create demand for the feeding into that. And so it might well start to make the economics work out, where more people want a jacket made from recycled materials, more people want a bag made from recycled materials. So we can now pay people a little extra to process those single-use bottles and move them back into the value stream.
You're actually creating an entire new industry driven by the demand, the heightened demand by consumers.
Exactly.
Which I remember my question.
Yes.
I think, the economics behind it is a big part of it. As a customer, I would probably think that recycled materials should be cheaper, because you're not having the cost of having to extract materials out of the Earth's core. So can you talk a little bit about, is it cheaper? Why is it not cheaper? And, maybe in the future, if we are creating this demand in this new industry, do you see it as one of those materials like renewable energy and solar power that over time will become a cheaper option?
Yeah, so this nicely sort of draws back to the earlier discussion around global politics around fossil fuels and petroleum and those sorts of things. So right now, Australia, which is our home base for Bellroy, there's all sorts of issues going on with what much of the population wants versus what the government believes it needs to do to get re-elected. And many countries like Australia also have governments that believe they've got to make jobs. And if they can keep the economy growing, then those jobs will happen and the economy will go well and they'll get re-elected. Now, there's absolutely an element of truth in this. Like, if we're all out of jobs, it's not going to work. Like, the world will regress, it will be terrible. But one of the challenges there is you can see governments so often essentially giving away those oil reserves to anyone that will create some new jobs. And so it is artificially cheap to suck the oil out of the ground. And so virgin plastics, you as you said earlier, you're basically getting it for free because you don't have the externalities, because even the governments are giving away that resource artificially cheap just to try and tick the box of we're creating jobs.
Yeah.
And so recycling has to compete with that. So it's in the same way as solar powers acceptance has been slowed because there's so many subsidies going into traditional fuel industries. I'm aware a bit of this is almost coming around politics again, and it's a real challenge. It is, and while it would be beautiful to say let's all just do what's right, I think the global economy would collapse. I think there are many things where we have to progressively move towards other solutions, and that gives us time to understand all the other interdependencies and all the other factors that have to be balanced, because we do have to keep economies growing. I guarantee, like, if the world throws out every economic requirement and just focuses on sustainability, we will collapse in so many of the structures that we take for granted and we're used to. And so it's about progress and transition and moving towards better. And if we try and do a massive leap at once, we will get it wrong. There's so many interdependencies in a global economy and even in a domestic economy that if we try and do this one massive overreaction, I think we'll create all sorts of chaos and turmoil that doesn't actually then help us towards a better world. One of the things we really do see is people, the more comfortable people are with all their basic needs, food, job, health, family, those sorts of things, the more they're able to start rising above those basic needs and start thinking beyond themselves, start looking at philanthropy, start looking at sustainability, start looking at better ways. And I think as soon as we take away that progress and take away development of people's own lives and in their own little world, I think we'll actually do more harm than good. So it's about finding ways that we can move towards better practices faster, but without believing we can just throw out everything old, because there's still a lot of evolution in why those structures are set up the way they are.
Yeah, no, totally. And yeah, sustainability is inherently, a business imperative. You can't be in business if you're not sustaining yourself. And so much of sustainability, as this new movement that we're all a part of, is efficiency. And that is, great for business. So just as you're saying, you can't stay in business if you're not making money, and the world, in the economies that we have existing need to continue to exist. So yeah, it's about taking the baby steps forward, and recycled materials is one of those baby steps. Not the solution, I think we both agree, but one of the many steps to get us to this circular future. And we're looking at that ultimate perpetual recycling, if we can recycle things over and over and over again. So these recycled products that you're making, you guys have pretty bold, you're doing an overhaul, essentially. You've got some really bold goals for this all to really happen in the next couple of years. So what are those goals, and what are you really trying to signal to the rest of the industry?
So one of the challenges for the way Bellroy communicates in the world is that we've always wanted to be the people that under-promise and over-deliver. And so we haven't previously talked about those future goals as much, because we wanted to do the work and kind of prove that we're well on track and make those goals believable to ourselves and to everyone else when we started to talk about them. And so what we've essentially said, so we started with various time frames. The first time frame was October this year, and it was that we wanted 30% of our new products released in bags, pouches, that whole space, to be made from recycled content. Now, we're well ahead of that. So one of the decisions we made that I'm really glad about was we'd already worked out we'd developed many unique materials, many unique wovens, ways of creating interest in wovens to create products that we hoped would have a long life and stay desirable the whole way. And what we've done is learned how to move recycled yarn streams into those existing fabrics. And so we're actually going through updating our existing fabrics, but each new fabric we launch, each new colourway we launch, we're making sure that is already in the recycled stream. And so we've said we're committing to 90% of the new products we launch by next year to be recycled by the end of next year. So what's essentially happening is we're having a rapid onboarding of these recycled polymers. Polyesters start because that tech is more developed, the feed stream is more developed. We can basically sub out virtually every polyester fabric we make for this, and so that's happening rapidly. And then as I touched on briefly before, nylon's a harder one, and so it's beginning with recycled content in the nylons. But if we jump 100% to a recycled nylon right now, we can't guarantee that bag will be thriving past day 1000, and so we're having to move a little slower to that. Things like linings are a little easier. Most of our linings are polyester, so that's a wonderful swap. That swap out is also happening into wallet linings that are using polyesters. And then from there, though, what we've said is we don't just want it to be recycled. It can also be a biological nutrient. And so we're also working very hard on developing some biological nutrient materials that can move into many of our other product categories as well as bags. And so a lot's happening behind the scenes on that. And what we're hoping is we'll be able to share some of our journey with that. So if there's smaller brands out there, they can find out where some of these are coming from, how achievable this is these days. And then we're also working really hard to learn from the bigger brands, the amazing inspirations like Patagonia and many of the other brands that have helped pioneer this space and develop it to a point where a brand of our size can now draw on that research, do a little rejigging to make sure it speaks to our brand values, and then release. So we're also working very closely with many other brands to share the learning and the journey and talk about what we're finding success in and share the challenges we're finding and try and find help and guidance in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, you make it sound pretty easy. Just, 30% to 90% the following year, you're just going to swap out all your materials, and it's quite a big lofty goal compared to some of the sustainability targets that we see other companies put out where they have 10-year plans to get to 25% fibers, and here you are just saying, next year 90%.
So, and I think that's evidence that we didn't start working on this yesterday.
Yeah.
This has been a long time developing and working and pioneering. The teams here have done a lot of work in really understanding how a material ages, degrades, what we need to test for, how we need to look at things. And so it's been many years in the making. That means now, as we finally feel it's at the right point, now we can accelerate it in very quickly. And we're so aware of everything we're not yet doing. There's still so many parts to each bag, each product that we still want to work on. We still believe we need to use virgin nylon thread because it's the only one we can see that, it's such a common failure point for bags when people take shortcut on thread.
Mm-hmm.
So there's still parts to the bag. We're still working on several really compelling foams that might be able to move us into a whole new space for the way we bring structure to the back panel of a bag or pad a shoulder strap. We're working in many other areas to see we're now trying to make sure some of the recycled component zippers can be onboarded and will live up to the performance expectations we believe are required. So there's many parts to that, and at the moment we're essentially Paretoing our impact. So Pareto is that notion of sort of track it from the biggest to the smallest, and often 20% will have 80% of the impact. And for us, we've really said if we can get the external and the internal fabrics, that's still most of the embodied energy there, and then that will start to transition into webbings, into other components, all of that. That's what will then follows straight on the tail of that.
Yeah, I think it's difficult that there's, well, especially in accessories and bags, there's so many elements and so many components that make up the clothing we wear and the bags we use that we don't often think about, you know, not even to mention the dyes and the fabric finishings, but like you said, the foams and the paddings and the threads and the trims and everything that goes into it. It's not only about fabric. So you mentioned that you've been working on this for several years, and here we are now finally talking about it all. What have been the biggest challenges, I guess? I would guess that, you know, the foams and the trims are challenges, and as you've mentioned, those are next steps that you'll be taking. But what have you really had to overcome, I guess, to get to this point?
Yeah.
So much, I'm sure.
Yeah, so anytime there's something new moving into the global economies, it generally starts with a few pioneers. And so that means it's generally only available in the sorts of materials that are the more mainstream materials rather than the niche materials. When you feel a Bellroy fabric, you will feel it's generally woven in a very different way to most fabrics. Some of our yarns we create a crinkle effect on, so when it weaves in you get this incredible sort of shimmer and life to it. Many of the things we're doing to try and create a unique Bellroy DNA look and feel that we hope will be used and loved for as long as possible are not in the mainstream palette of colours, of yarn sizes, of traditional kind of source stock that feeds into what gets made. And so we've had to work hard to find the things that can speak well for Bellroy's DNA and not just be a generic PET rewoven into a very flat 210 denier kind of polyester.
Not just walking into a shop and picking something off the shelf.
Exactly. It needs to have our identity in it. And the reason we value that is because that identity has been informed so much by that desire to have people use and love the product for as long as possible. And we know that even if we made the most sustainable product, if people get sick of it after 6 weeks, that's a failure.
Yeah.
You know, the embodied energy, the impact of making that, it's only justified if these products can live a long, vibrant life and stop people buying other things to replace them with.
That's the number one sustainable design principle, is that you have to design products people want. They still have to be beautiful and functional. And now there's all of these other requirements that we have to take into consideration as well, which I think is something that Bellroy does really well, in addition to, function and aesthetic and community. You are a leader in the space, you're a B Corp. What do you hope that other Carry brands or even other apparel brands can take from, the overhaul that you guys are doing in this swift uptake of materials? What would you like them to take from this, or the advice you would have to give?
Yeah, so I think the more brands knowing that customers will resonate with more sustainable practices. So customers need to value it because it is harder work. It does cost more to do it the right way, or to do it a slightly better way than has been done before. And so customers need to value it. Then brands need to be convinced that they value it. And then you need to help everyone with their journey for what's relevant to where they are right now. If it's a brand new Kickstarter brand, they're going to stress about ordering minimums of fabric. Mm-hmm. They can't go out and custom make, really unique fabrics. It's just not going to work. And so I think there's many stages where different brands are at, where all of them, you just want them to take a step further and then a step further and a step further, rather than saying do nothing until you can be the most perfect in the world. One of the things that we really are hoping to leverage going forwards is, before Bellroy there was Carryology, and that was the blog we launched way back in 2009, and that was this idea around so many brands and people were thinking of bags and luggage and wallets and those carry goods, the way you carry your things through the world, thinking of those products together, but there hadn't even been a name for it. And we were like, well, they're carry goods. We started Carryology, and that's now grown into an incredibly vibrant global community. It's an absolute leader in acting as a campfire for brands and fans and all sorts of partners to come around and learn and develop and progress. We review product, we talk about what's good, what's not. We have our Carry 101 section that's going into fundamentals of great design in the carry space and what makes it right. We get to interview our heroes, the best carry designers and brands and thinkers in the space. And that can serve as a phenomenal education platform now into sustainability. And so at the moment, Carryology itself is also ready to go through another evolution, and we're working really hard on that role of using Carryology as a thought leader in the carry space to really teach, inspire, educate, and hold people's hands through that journey towards more sustainable practices. So I think we're very fortunate that we've put so much work into that over the last decade, and we're hoping that will play one of the key pieces. But then we're also really active in the B Corp community that you mentioned. Benefit Corps are about identifying that there's more goals to business than just profit, and so it's a intensive process where you go through and external people audit your company to see if you are actually living beyond the profit motive and you're actually using business as a force for good. And so that community, just to get in and be a certified B Corp is really hard. You have to jump through a number of hoops. It's achievable. We want more and more businesses to do it, and they are. But then that also creates an incredible community to share thinking and ideas. And we've been so lucky with the way many other brands have shared their learning and insights. And now we want to see if we can repay our favour for brands that might be going through stages like ours. And then we will continue to learn from, the amazing Patagonias of the world and the people who've been doing this at a much bigger scale than we can. Nike, Patagonia, great companies like that in the sustainable business space. B Corp herds many of those together, and then our leather working group that we're also actively involved in, that's where we get to work a lot with the bigger brands that maybe are not yet B Corps. Hopefully they will be in the future. But
Is that a call out to them?
Yeah, but just the work Nike's done on so many sustainability mappings and their material assessment platforms and those sorts of things, they've blazed trails in other areas of sustainability. And so we're trying to actively be part of several communities where whatever structure the brand wants to put to it, they are pushing the edges of sustainability. They're learning new ways with bigger R&D budgets, bigger progress, more influence in a supply chain. They really pioneer it. We learn to adapt it to our scale. We teach down. So I think it's a series of communities of people all motivated by something beyond profit, all trying to push their little area of sustainability. And so far we've found incredible trust in the way people share within these different communities as well.
How do you remain so optimistic in all of this? I mean, I think, the company seems very optimistic just kind of in its character. You especially seem very optimistic despite talking about, all of these externalities in the world, these economies and these kind of bigger existential issues. When you're working with these materials, essentially, you still are using plastic. You still are part of, a petroleum-based material. How do you kind of put that all aside and feel good about taking these baby steps? Because I think you're exactly right that can be a huge barrier to some people, is feeling like if your step isn't big enough, then it's not even worth taking. So.
Yeah.
What do you do?
So,
is it the surfing? Is that what it is?
So surfing helps, being immersed in nature helps, but I think we've been very involved in the effective altruism community. So this was a community that essentially evolved over the last 10 or 20 years to say, if you want to do good in the world, how can you do the most good? So how do you use not just the heart, but also the head to do good? And part of that work in the effective altruism community means we get to work with some phenomenal non-profits that have just made blazing progress in huge chunks of like the biggest issues that the world is facing. And so when you do that, you start to realize that humankind has made phenomenal progress in so many areas. If you look at child mortality, it has plummeted. If you look at abject poverty, it has plummeted. If you look at so many of the metrics for how the majority of humans are living, it has improved. The problem has been that single narratives have dominated part of global economies. So, you know, the single job of a company is to maximize shareholder return. Like, that was an idea that only arose in the 60s and 70s. And it dominated so many boardrooms that we saw they were all optimizing for one thing and breaking everything else in the process of optimizing for a single metric. When you actually go back through humankind, though, there have been just incredible amounts of progress made, like eradicating smallpox. You know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are behind potentially eradicating polio as well. Like, these are diseases that have killed millions and millions of people that have put them through horrible lives. When you look at the progress that non-profits like Against Malaria Foundation are making in distributing bed nets, like malaria used to just kill so many millions of kids and families, and they've managed to radically reduce that by distributing bed nets for so little money. You know, like $5 can get a bed net into a family where multiple kids can sleep under it. When humankind wants to do something, we are phenomenal at doing it. And it's like there are so many people in the world that will just change their entire life to go at a goal. And when we can recognize things as being valuable goals, man, we can hustle. And it's like that when you see news stories, it does feel like we're plummeting into chaos and all sorts of horrible things are happening. The reality is we've prioritized humanity over the planet and animals, and we have made phenomenal progress for humanity's position. Now we've just got to broaden that lens a little bit and say, well, now how can we start to work towards something where, you know, animals and the planet and people are each nurturing each other and moving towards a system like that. Now, that might sound a bit silly for a company using a lot of leather to say, but one of the things we've been doing behind the scenes for many years now, we helped we were the inaugural chair and the ongoing chair of an animal welfare group that is part of the Leather Working Group. So Leather Working Group is the largest and most successful leather sustainability body in the world, working with the massive brands of the world to try and develop better sustainability practices in the leather supply chain. And we've successfully, there's a whole series of incredible brands, the biggest brands in the world in leather, all now working together to say, how can we improve the plight of animals that then go into having their hides used in leather. And that's also a whole series of work we're doing. We've supported Farm Forward for many years. They're doing incredible work on trying to reduce the issues of factory farming. And so it's like that. This is a really challenging space because it could feel like we are part of the problem. And in some ways what we're doing is saying, well, given where we are, can we help the massive guys make progress on leather and on horrible factory farming practices? Can we work there from inside? And then can we then also work on alternatives that totally bypass animal products? And I think it's just this sort of pragmatic vibe where for us it's been less about being able to say we are high and mighty and we only do pure things, It's been more about, well, these things are going to continue to happen. How can we get in and start moving many areas in better directions? And most of the time that's not even us moving it, it's just helping make sure that people who can do phenomenal things just have that bit of extra support or a bit of extra money or a bit of extra something. And so I think we've just thought, like, who cares who gets the credit? Can we just get in and see if we can use our own special skills to help rad folk do even better things in the world? And if we're making progress, it's a good thing. And then can we accelerate that progress? And if we all throw our hands up in the air and say it's hopeless, we're all doomed, that's not going to get us to utopia.
Yeah.
It's like, let's get in, let's get our hands dirty, let's try and understand the problems from inside and outside.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just see what we can do to help move anyone forwards into one of those good directions.
It actually sounds, the leather conversation sounds quite parallel actually to the recycled material conversation, in that you're saying, yeah, it's not a perfect solution, it's not the only solution, and it's unfortunately the way the world works, but you gotta get in there and make things better from where you are and do what you can and continue to progress it all forward to, I guess, get us to that utopia, but unfortunately we're not there yet. But just covering your eyes and pretending, waiting until we have our spaceship to Mars, where apparently utopia is, isn't going to do anything. So it's actually quite interesting to see how those are quite aligned in kind of their status and the work you're doing in both of them.
And I think for us, it was, when you really get into livestock, cattle livestock, beef livestock, most of the value is in the meat. So people talk about leather being a byproduct of the meat industry. It's not quite true, because anytime there's a value in something, it becomes part of the value chain. But if we all of a sudden all stop using leather and it just starts to become a waste product, it makes cows less profitable to grow and farm and do these things. But it feels like we might eventually get to the spot where we have excellent meat substitutes, we have excellent things that give us these other parts that economies value and people value. But at the moment, it's a gritty, difficult conversation. People care a lot about this space. You get into heated conversations. We're not pretending our way is the best way guaranteed. What we're doing is we're trying to keep our eyes really open. We're trying to be really practical. We're trying to understand what things are we good at. When you look at what you can make a wallet from, leather is still the best material for many wallets. It ages incredibly well, it lasts so well, the value improves as you settle into your wallet and it becomes one with you, the patina improves. When we've looked at so many of the petroleum substitutes for this, they crack, they degrade, you end up going through it much faster, it's swapping one problem for another. But then there's some incredibly exciting stuff happening in this lab-grown space. So we're working really hard in the biosynthetic space to understand, are there entirely new alternatives to leather that would actually perform as well as leather does? But there's still going to be this huge meat industry operating. And if we can get in and start to push from the higher value stuff, like these amazing premium leathers that brands can value and sell at a premium, can we start to actually influence that whole supply chain and improve visibility, improve farm practices, improve that? So it's trickier. It would be much simpler as a brand to say we stay right away from every animal product, we stay right away from everything else. But I think that's just going to leave these industries to operate without anyone that's really motivated to improve how they operate. And so we prefer to just get in amongst it and see if we can help influence minds and how decisions are made there, if we can improve transparency, if we can help consumers understand when a material is appropriate and when it's not, if we can help them know there's been less harm in having that material arrive at you.
Well, I think if, you could take anything from this conversation, it would be that things are much more complicated than they seem, and that everything really is connected, and that it's not as easy as just saying, oh, well, we don't use that material, we use this other thing. Because even if you don't use leather and you're not involved in all of the complications of the meat industry, then you're using a petroleum product, and there's all the externalities with that. So it really is a lot more complex than just saying, great, we used recycled polyester, we saved a bunch of water bottles, high fives, we can all go home. It's a continued conversation and effort, and yeah, I think just feeling good about the steps you are taking forward while still knowing that
we have
there's a
so
huge
much to
mountain
do.
climb.
There is a huge mountain, and it is so true. Any time I hear a voice of certainty in the sustainability space, I call bullshit. It's like, you cannot be certain. There are so many interdependencies. There's so much influence from the economic model to the business model to the narrative model to the desire model. There's so many things that anyone that knows they know best, I'm sorry, something that none of the other phenomenal humans working in the space that I've worked with actually know, because the more you get into it, the more you realise it's murky.
It's so difficult.
It's so difficult, and that's where I think
we keep learning new things every year.
Oh, so true. And the technology improves. Like, we could say technology is the devil, but actually technology might actually be one of the things that helps gets us to the next stage and through the quagmire. And you get into it, it gets murky, it gets horrible, it gets disheartening, but then you start to find those beautiful ropes out of the quagmire that have a silken thread that's made from synthetic spider silk and it's whatever else, and you start to pull on those and start to drag yourself out a bit. And I think there is hope. There is more happening in this space than I've ever seen happen for the 20 years I've cared deeply about it. I think we're seeing beautiful philosophies and approaches like cradle to cradle being reinvented under the circularity lens and being given new life. We're seeing new, eucalyptus pulp fibres. We're seeing new technologies as a way to break it down. And so I think, yes, you've got to say there's a mess in the world right now, but there's also these phenomenal spotlights of hope and these incredible people working so hard on these problems with a pragmatic, real vibe to them. And that, I don't know, I find that part exciting.
So what's your call to action on a customer level? It's obviously not throw out all your products and buy ones made from recycled plastics. And how do you how do you weigh that with being a business that needs to sell products in order to create profit?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little while ago, when we were really thinking about one of the key things we need to do, it's there has been billions of dollars of marketing spent telling you that new is best. And it's in so many companies' incentives to tell you that the first day you get something is the best day it will ever be, and it starts losing value as soon as you use it. And I think if you just get people to stop and think about the things they love most in their life, that generally that love and that passion has been built over time. You've grown together with a person and a relationship. You've worked that denim jean in until it resembles your body and your shape and it's comfortable in all the right spots. And when you just get people to realise so many of the great things that you value have been built over time, that it's been this slow path to delight and joy. And so learn to see the beauty in something that you've broken in. Learn to realise that the flash of brand new, the quick endorphin rush you get when you've just walked out for this new desirable thing, it's like, actually think, is the old thing better in some ways? There's something I love about it. And so I think it's like, learn to see the beauty in patina, learn to see the beauty in a journey of being with a product. And so we talk about day 1000. And it's like, how do you make something even better on day 1000? And we can think of a great pair of denim jeans as something like that, or a great wallet that you've broken into, it shapes around your contents. It's one with you now almost. It just fits you and your life, and it tells the stories of things. So learn to see the beauty in something you've grown with is one, and then when things are too cheap to be true, they've probably taken a shortcut. And so we do through Carryology, we get many brands want to send us bags and look, it's an amazing cheap bag and it's $20. And when we know how hard it is to build a bag well, when we know how hard it is to have materials that haven't had an extreme negative impact on the world, I can't see how to build a bag that sells at $20 unless it's a very simple bag. I get that. And so I think there's also like the buy less, buy better. And that's not to say buy more expensive, it's buy better. Like start to think about the journey that has been in that product up until it reaches you. That's where most of the energy and impact is. What sort of journey has it been? Start to find the companies sharing their credentials. Like, are they using BlueSign? Are they a B Corp? And BlueSign's a platform we're not on for various reasons, but it's a great platform. There's many other things triggering right now around climate neutral is a new platform that Peak Design's one of our backpack, I guess you could call them competitors, but we see them as almost brothers and sisters, is that they're now trying to build a whole new platform around how do companies deal with their carbon emissions, how do they quantify, how do they offset, how do they do things. So it's like try and support those brands and platforms that are trying to move it beyond just the sticker price and trying to get you to understand where it's come from. I think the world's getting so much better at that with anything you put into yourself. Like we've seen the growth in organic food. I think that's a beautiful example where people will start to value things that have been made in more responsible ways. And I think I'm excited to see that start to move out. If you only ever want to use something once, rent it, don't buy it. I think it's great starting to see this kind of rental economy growing. If you don't need a car every day, rent it when you need it, jump in an Uber the other times. Like, I think just starting to think of, is this something I need in my life every day or every week, or is it something that I could just borrow? I think there's lots of that about just reducing what you buy, buying better with a goal to find things that you will fall more and more in love with as they age and progress. Yes, that will mean we can sell less product, but I think we're after selling better product that creates better relationships, and we don't want to sell to everyone. We don't want to sell everything. We want to do what we do, and I think there's a lot of people that should just think about what things will bring value and what value has had to be consumed or created to get that thing to them.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough, stance as a company, and I'm sure a lot would think, well, how can I do that? Because I need to keep my doors open. But I think that it's so great that is built into the company here, and that you kind of take it as this like great design challenge. Well, our top value is to provide quality product, and if that means we have to figure out how to make money in other ways, then so be it. But so I guess your call to action really is keep what you have and love what you have, and then when you do need to buy something new,
buy better.
Recycled Bellroy.
Well, no. But buy the thing that is fit for purpose.
Yeah.
And it's really understanding like our bags, our wallets, our products are not right for everyone. But gosh, when we find the person who recognises the amount of care and love that has gone into them, it brings a lot of joy. Yeah. And what we hope is it's when people need the new product is when they will discover us and engage with us, rather than when people just see something new and think, oh, maybe I'll have one of those. Yeah. It's a little bit more time, and there's still so many people where other product is breaking and wearing out and soiling and becoming really kind of revolting to use, and that's when we hope we can jump in and take them on a better journey that they'll get more life out of.
It actually does seem like a bit of a relief from a business standpoint to just say, you know what, we're not going to make product for everyone and just focus on who your customer is, and then just do it really well. And then they get the best from it, and so do you. So it's win-win. So I guess my last question is, when your customers then are done with their products, where can they send them?
So this is absolutely a project we're working on with Tess, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll have a process for that. I think that's something we do really want to care about. We've been so focused on longevity of product. We knew it was the biggest thing we could change and influence for more sustainable product. But it feels like now that we're well on track with that, now it's time for us to get back and close the loop.
Yeah, your next
So
steps.
stay tuned, I think.
Always taking steps forward, that's the plan.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for being a part of it. It's been incredible to start work with you. As many people in this space are there with the heart and often with their head, they haven't yet shaped like tangible principles and guidelines and whole frameworks that can take you forward. And I think starting to engage with you around that space, there were so many things that even though we've each been learning our chops in the sustainability game in different channels, we've ended up in such similar places. I think there are some fundamental principles that can help guide people to make better choices that are realistic, that can still leave profit in the business to then go and do the other great non-profit work or whatever else the business wants to do with the funds. And I think just it's been really fun engaging with you and realising that there are still holes in our thinking, there are still gaps, and we'll try and plug those as quickly as we can, and then keep emphasising the things where we think we can take a leadership position. It's great fun. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Well, I think it's also too just, what we've talked a lot about today is just it's not the same solution for everyone, and that there isn't one solution. And so, it's been really fun to work on these kind of bigger concept level and thinking level. And if you can really get those ideas down, then you naturally just figure out the solutions for your business, because there's no checklist to hand anyone to say, go do these things.
I think that's exactly right.
So it's been
Thank
fun.
you. Awesome.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Tess.